In this lesson, you're going to learn how to calculate Apple's levered beta for use in the formula for cost of equity for the company. Now, just to recap, in the last two videos, we looked at some of the key assumptions that we use in the weighted average cost of capital formula, and then we went through the comparable companies and you learned about the difference between levered beta and unlevered beta, and then the relationship between them and why we need to look at both of them in this analysis. We figured out the median of the set of comparable companies, both levered beta right here and then unlevered beta over here, and then we also saw Apple's historical beta of 1.57 right here. What we need to do now is take this median from the set of comparable companies here, and we're going to actually use this and calculate what Apple's levered beta should actually be. So we've seen that based on current market data, their levered beta should be around 1.57. That's according to Google Finance. But what we want to do is actually look at the comparable companies and use them to figure out what Apple's levered beta should be. The reason for this, the reason why we do this, is actually very similar to why we value the company in the first place. Remember, we could look at Apple's current equity value and enterprise value and say, okay, Apple's enterprise value is 141 billion, that's how much the company's worth. So we could do that. But what we're actually doing in this case is we're looking at public company comparables, at M&A transactions, and at the DCF, and we're trying to establish from these what Apple's true value should really be. And the reason is because often market data, even though it's real actual data, is not 100% accurate, and we like to come up with our own estimate of the company's value. And we go into this calculation for levered beta for Apple, our own calculation, for a similar reason. We do have this market data, but we don't always want to go with it. We also want to look at an alternative calculation and see what Apple's true risk might actually be. So to get to this number, if you remember from before, we went through the calculation, the derivation for levered beta and unlevered beta, and we're going to follow a very similar procedure to get to levered beta here. So what I'm going to do here is for unlevered beta, I'm going to link directly to the public company comparables, the median unlevered beta from right there. For the debt, I'm going to go back to our three-statement model for Apple, and I'm just going to pull the debt number in directly from there. Then for the equity value, I'm also going to go back to the three-statement model and get the diluted equity value from right there. For the tax rate, go back to the three-statement model once again, and I'm going to pull Apple's standard tax rate of 30% from there. So now we have all this information. Notice here that, of course, Apple does not have any debt, so we would expect the unlevered beta to be exactly the same as the levered beta. That being the case, we still want to make the calculation here just to make sure that our model is flexible enough to handle the case where Apple actually had debt on its balance sheet. So for the calculation here, remember that the derivation for levered beta is the following. Levered beta equals unlevered beta plus unlevered beta times 1 minus the tax rate times debt over equity. And if we wanted to be a bit more fancy here, we could take the fact that we're adjusting unlevered beta to figure out how much is coming from the risk imposed by debt here. We could take that and we could actually factor out unlevered beta. We could say levered beta equals unlevered beta times 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate times debt over equity, just using basic algebra here. So we're going to use this exact formula. I'm going to say that levered beta here equals our unlevered beta times 1 plus 1 minus tax rate times the debt to equity ratio. And as expected, we see that in this case, the levered beta is exactly the same as the unlevered beta. So what this now lets us do is the following. Remember from before that the motivation for this, the whole reason why we're looking at beta in the first place, is because for cost of equity, we're going to take what we would get from investing in risk-free or relatively risk-free government bonds, plus the equity risk premium, times the adjustment factor. Now we have the equity risk premium from our assumption here at the top, we have the risk-free rate, and now what this levered beta calculation lets us do is actually figure out the appropriate adjustment factor to use in this calculation. Now, you might be wondering at this point, why is it that we use levered beta in this formula? Why is it that we don't use unlevered beta in this formula? Because we're trying to calculate this company's enterprise value, so why is it that we're using levered beta in the cost of equity formula? Here's how I would think about it. We know from our three-statement model, going over here, that when we have free cash flow, levered free cash flow, we use equity value because it includes the effects of interest expense and interest income, meaning that the only investors left who can actually get paid at this point are the equity investors, the shareholders. We know from our DCF analysis that unlevered free cash flow, by contrast, gets us to enterprise value right here. So looking at these, so levered free cash flow equals equity value, and unlevered free cash flow equals enterprise value. So think about what we're actually doing here. We're looking at the cost of equity. We're not looking at the cost of enterprise value or the cost of enterprise. We're looking at the cost of equity right here. We're only focusing on the equity of the company. And so for the adjustment factor, we want to be using the levered beta because we want to be taking into account the effects of debt here. Very similar to why levered free cash flow leads to equity value here. For cost of equity, we want to be using levered beta because if we used unlevered beta, we'd be taking out the impact of debt, interest, and the tax affected interest of that debt. So that's why we use levered beta for our cost of equity calculation and why we need to actually calculate levered beta for Apple here as opposed to just using the median unlevered beta from the set of public company comparables. So that's the motivation for why we actually need to unlever beta the first time around with our set of comparables here and find the median, and then why we need to relever it when we're actually calculating the cost of equity for Apple. So now that you know the reasoning behind this and some of the finance theory that goes into it, as well as how to actually make the calculation, the mechanics of the calculation, coming up in the next video, I'm going to show you how to calculate cost of equity and then finally get to WACC, weighted average cost of capital, and you'll see how everything ties together into our analysis right here.